Thank you all for being here. My name is Kendra Bradner. I'm a senior staff associate at the Justice Lab at Columbia University, recently transplanted from Harvard Kennedy School, so that's not actually wrong. And I'll serve as moderator for today's panel. Before we jump in, I'm just going to give very brief introductions of each of our panelists just by name and title. They've all done amazing things, and so their full bios will be on the conference website if you'd like to check those out. To my left is Bruce Western. He's professor of sociology at Columbia University. To his left is Vincent Schiraldi, senior research scientist at the Columbia School of Social Work. To his left is Cheryl Wilkins, senior program manager at Columbia University's Center for Justice. To her left is John Wetzel, secretary of corrections for the state of Pennsylvania. And to his left, last but certainly not least, is Ann Jacobs, director of the Prisoner Reentry Institute here at John Jay College. So we'll jump right into some opening remarks, and then my hope for today is that we'll be able to have just a really interesting moderated conversation with plenty of time for questions from the audience at the end. Today's conversation stems in part from the experience of an executive session on community corrections, which was held at the Harvard Kennedy School over the past 3 years. And several papers came out of that session, which was charged with thinking about how community corrections, probation and parole, and other community programs could enter a new paradigm in the context of criminal justice reform and hopefully lowered rates of incarceration. And so I'm going to ask Bruce and Vinny to start us out by talking about two papers which came out of that session, which are particularly relevant for today's discussion. But then we'll sort of move on from that to, as a jumping off point, to a general conversation about innovations in community corrections and important things to keep in mind as we move forward with reform in this space. So Bruce, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay.
And you can use that mic.
Is it working? No. Is it working? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Kendra, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging Carol Mason and Ed Chung, who have made space on their program for a discussion of community corrections reform and the executive session on community corrections that was conducted at the Kennedy School at Harvard over the last 3 years. And just by way of introduction, the executive session process is a policy-making process that started at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and it draws together about 30 leading policymakers, practitioners, and researchers who meet together twice a year over a 3-year period to work on a pressing national policy problem. The executive session on community corrections really grew out of the National Academy of Science report on very high incarceration rates in the United States. And a central recommendation of the NAS report was that very high incarceration rates be reduced, and that we in fact reverse the policies of mass incarceration. And that recommendation makes very urgent, I think, the question of, well, what would we do differently? And National Institute of Justice thought that community corrections would have a very important role in that process, and the executive session was conceived to address this question of the role of community corrections in this larger process of criminal justice reform. The session itself consisted of leading chiefs of probation and parole, sheriffs, judges, leading secretaries of corrections, like John Wetzel from Pennsylvania on the panel today, legal scholars, sociologists, economists, and we met over a 3-year period. In the course of our discussion, consensus began to emerge, not really over policy specifics, but around several core values that we thought the future of community corrections should really be aspiring to. If we're to reimagine the criminal justice system, then what community corrections currently does should fundamentally be transformed. And so as a group, we wrote a consensus paper, which is unusual for the executive session process. And this consensus paper described 5 core values that we thought represent the future of community corrections. So let me quickly run through these 5 core values before handing over to Vinny. First value, the fundamental goal of community corrections is the well-being and safety of communities. So what does that mean? It means that people have order and predictability in their daily life. They're free of threats from crime, for instance, but not just crime. They're also free of threats from the arbitrary intrusions of police and other criminal justice agencies. It also means that they have a level of material well-being in their lives that provides them with security and predictability in everyday life. So this is a thick kind of public safety that we're thinking about. And this kind of public safety isn't chiefly produced by the threat of sanctions, by punishment, by criminal justice agencies. It really originates in communities from families, neighbourhoods, community organisations, employers, dense networks of institutions. These are the sources of public safety that we're imagining, and community corrections should allow communities to be safe in that way. So that's the first value that we really gained consensus around. Second value, so the capacity of the state to arrest people, to incarcerate people, that is an awesome state power. And that should be approached with great trepidation. And community corrections agencies have that power, and reflecting a respect for it means that it should be used parsimoniously. It should be used minimally. So one concrete implication is that incarceration should never be the default response to violations. And in fact, in our consensus document, we proposed that reincarceration should be eliminated for simple technical violations of the conditions of parole or probation supervision. More broadly, it means an emphasis on a very light touch wherever possible in the community correction system, and Vinny is going to talk much more about that. So, first goal was community well-being and safety, a thick kind of public safety that really originated in community life. Second was parsimony in application of powers of arrest and incarceration. The third value that the executive session really came together around really tried to recognise the human dignity and affirm the human dignity of people who were caught up in the system. And this third value tried to affirm human dignity by redefining the mission of community corrections as social integration, trying to promote for people who have come into conflict with the law pro-social roles in their communities where they themselves could contribute in a productive way to thick public safety, to a rich community life. So this is a very different value, right, from monitoring conditions of supervision. And I think there was a view in the executive session that old-style community corrections had really become significantly about monitoring conditions of supervision, but what we should be aspiring to is promoting social integration of people who have come into conflict with the law and participate in a process of community repair in the aftermath of crime. Fourth value. Community corrections agencies are charged with this, this awesome state power. They very much the pointy end of the stick when it comes to the implementation, the administration of the law. For that reason, community corrections themselves in their internal operations should be pillars of the rule of law. And I think this idea that corrections agencies should be pillars of the rule of law is guided by the intuition that where you have power, you are at risk of the abuse of power. And we spend a lot of time as a group thinking of that, and partly this means cultivating community corrections as pillars of the rule of law means a cultural change within correctional agencies in which there's a culture of respect for the people who are under the agency's supervision. Partly, I think it also means inviting transparency and oversight of all different kinds. Partly public transparency, partly transparency to media organisations, to researchers, and to the civic culture at large. So that's the fourth value. Community corrections must be pillars of the rule of law. The final idea is because community corrections in our reimagined system are charged with now the mission of social integration, and because the criminal justice system, as we're now conceiving it, is charged with promoting a rich kind of community well-being. Community corrections is really at the leading edge, at the cutting edge of the criminal justice function, and it has a responsibility to the rest of the system, a responsibility to infuse norms of fairness and justice to the system writ large. Community corrections occupies a strategically important place in the system because it is the interface between the system and the community itself. So I think those five ideas lead us to really a radically different kind of criminal justice system. It's much less punitive, much less retributive, much more concerned about the repair of community life in the aftermath of crime. And it's interesting, I think, our original charge stemmed from the incarceration report of the National Academies. And I think we were all thinking about the reduction of institutional populations. I think where we ended up was somewhere much broader, and I think we're left opening up a new kind of policy discussion that really tries to rethink the foundations of what criminal justice should be. And I think that's really the unfinished work of this conversation. So with that, let me turn it over to Vinny.
Thanks, Bruce. That was a great sort of lead into what I'm about to talk about. My name's Vinny Schiraldi. I'm at the Columbia Justice Lab. It's a brand new lab. I made this letterhead up for this presentation. I think Kendra is abruptly going to not have me be in charge of doing that, but Kendra, Bruce, and I all migrated down, including almost every staff member from the program in criminal justice at the Kennedy School and all our projects. And the hope is to be a lean, mean, mass incarceration fighting machine at Columbia. So I'm gonna give you my so I'm gonna talk about the paper that Mike Jacobson, Reagan Daly, Emily Hotez, and I wrote. They're all from the Institute of State and Local Government at CUNY. It's called "Less is More: How Reducing Probation Populations Can Improve Outcomes." To take the overall conclusion of the paper is that mass probation has grown out of all proportions alongside mass incarceration over the last several decades. It was designed to sort of be a brake on incarceration. It has not served to be that, and instead has been a major contributor to mass incarceration. I want to leave you guys with 3 takeaways. I want to tell you about them now. Then you should feel free to check email, go to the bathroom, read the paper, whatever you want to do. One is this is a bigger problem than I think our advocacy, our research, our writing, our philanthropy has recognized. I think probation and parole have kind of gotten a pass. I could have sleptwalked through my 4 years as probation commissioner. Nobody was banging on my door. Everybody was yelling about prison and jail populations, and I had 3 times as many people on probation as were at Rikers. 1. 2, it may be easier in some respects. There may be some low-hanging fruit here. It may be easier to reduce probation and parole populations than to abolish mandatories, shrink sentences for violent offenders. This may be a place where you might have more inroads readily available, and you may already have the support of your local probation or parole chief on this. You almost certainly have the support of their trade association, as you'll hear later on. So I'll start with a little history. Founded in 1841 by John Augustus, probation was supposed to be really entirely a helping function to reduce people's incarceration or use of things like the stocks. Originally it was, quote, planned on being a plan of supervision and friendly guidance. It grew haphazardly over the years, always woefully inadequately funded, but especially so once the populations mushroomed. As it evolved from that helping function to sort of a trail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em approach. It is the most common sentence for folks. There's about 1.5 million people in prison, another about 600 and change in jail, 850,000 on parole, and 4 million, almost 4 million on probation. So there's about twice as many people under community supervision as in prison and jail, and that doesn't even count the people out on bail, under pretrial supervision, and with things like restraining orders. The conditions of probation have been onerous and are growing increasingly onerous. The average probation sentence carries 15 different conditions of probation, the violation of any one of which can result in a full deprivation of liberty and incarceration. I'm going to read one quote from the paper a public defender gave. Our clients, they have so many obstacles in so many ways that too many requirements, they just get overwhelmed. I had a client recently that just said, quote, fine, whatever, send me to prison, come get me on a warrant. He was just too overwhelmed to even think about complying with conditions of probation. This happened all the time when I was probation commissioner. If you were 19 years old and a black male living in Brownsville, and you had served 3-4 months waiting to be sentenced, and the worst you were looking at locally was a year, you'd take the year, because all you got is about 6 more months left to serve, and there was no way you were going to make it through 5 years as a black male living in Brownsville without getting rearrested. So that happened all the time to us. Not surprisingly, 40% of the people fail on probation. Most of those failures are technicals. Between probation and parole, half of the intake to prisons, almost half of the intake to prisons every year are violations of probation and parole. Most of those are technicals. I mentioned it was underfunded. Part of what happened here is attitudinal, the trail 'em, jail 'em, nail 'em mentality, but part of it's fiscal. The Pew Foundation has said that, has found that the average cost of probation is $3.42 a day, compared to $79 a day for jail. Now you have an overwhelmingly poor, unemployed, homeless, sometimes mentally ill, sometimes substance abusing population. You're trying to help them on $1,250 a year, most of which is going to public defender salary, not public defender, probation officer salaries and bloated salaries for commissioners like myself. So one thing that departments increasingly turned to was fees to support their departments. It's a lousy idea in a million ways, right? First of all, we're not good fee collectors. Probation officers aren't good at that. It changes the very nature of the relationship between a probation officer and the person they're supervising, and it skews incentives. There's actually an incentive to keep good performers on probation longer because they're the ones that pay the fees. Ron Corbett has a quote. Ron Corbett is at the Urbina Institute. The previous quote I read was from an Urbina Institute study that's at the University of Minnesota's law school. Terrific stuff they've done on this. And what Ron said was, as the financial penalties incurred by probationers grow, one wonders what those who imposed them imagined the financial standing of probationers to be. If it were the case that the average probationer could afford to pay all the costs, fines, and fees that are imposed, it would not have been a crime in the first place, quite possibly. So all of this sort of combines to real structural problems, increasing conditions and increasingly onerous conditions, fines going up, the population of people under community supervision growing, and an attitudinal change resulting in increased violations and incarceration to the point where, like I said, 1 out of every 2 people entering prisons is coming in for a violation of probation and parole. So I want to talk a little about downsizing. And I'll go to, that one. So this is the chart showing the growth in correctional populations in the U.S. You can see probation grew and parole alongside the growth in incarceration in jail. And so that says one thing, which is that it was meant to be a break, but if it's growing alongside incarceration, then it's not really serving as an alternative. And subsequently, as it started to shrink, incarcerated population shrunk as well. So at the very least, you can say 3 things. One is that it's possible to reduce probation and crime simultaneously. The other is that it's possible to reduce incarceration while in reducing probation. And the third, because crime has fallen more rapidly than probation populations, that means essentially that the probation per crime ratio has gone up. So you're more likely to get probation per offense today than you were when it started to decline. So I'm going to talk a little about New York City, which has dramatically reduced the number of people on probation. That's the New York City chart. It's a massive decline between 1996 and 2014. And I'll say a few words about some data. It's a 69% drop during that time, from 68,000 down to around 21. It's lower now. Judges substantially reduced their use of probation and increased conditional discharges, which is sort of like informal probation. So now only 4.3% of people convicted or arrested for felonies get probation, whereas 26% get informal dispositions. I'm wrapping up. And a whole bunch of other really cool stuff that you can see. Early discharges, a law we got passed that allowed the courts to give less than the maximum. It used to be 5 years, no matter what. And this massive shrinkage has essentially meant that the department now has about twice as much resources per probationer as it used to have. Even though their budgets declined, probation's budget declined, because the number of people on probation declined so much more rapidly, it kind of blew that away. So while we were getting ready to put this out, Mike Jacobson and I, Mike Nail, who's the head of Parole in Georgia, Barb Broderick and Wendy Still, chiefs of probation in Phoenix and Oakland, decided we would issue a statement and see if we could get folks to sign on to it. So we got 35 probation and parole chiefs, as well as the American Probation and Parole Association, Association of Paroling Authorities, Association of State Correctional Administrators, and the National Association of Probation Executives, and a bunch of other folks. So we had all the trade associations signed on to a statement that said, over the last 25 years, community corrections caseloads have grown exponentially, exceeding 5 million people at their peak. Designed originally as an alternative to incarceration, community corrections has become a significant contributor to mass incarceration. And as America's leading probation and parole officials, we believe it's possible to both significantly reduce the footprint of probation and parole and improve outcomes in public safety. So we recommend that the number of people on probation and parole be significantly reduced. This is a big deal. This is a big deal that these folks said this stuff, which is what gets me back to my original statement. We should and can substantially reduce the footprint of probation and parole. I think we're ignoring this, and I think we're ignoring this at the expense of mass incarceration. People are skipping over this, straight to jail and prison, and this is a major contributor. And you may have support locally. You absolutely have support in the trade associations. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Wilkins, and honored to be sitting here as a person who has lived experience on being on parole. And because we are making a coalition between parole and probation, you know, I can make the argument on what's it like to be on parole and trying to put your life in order with these systems that are put in place to supposedly want to assist you, but I can argue that they oftentimes hinder your progress. And so Vinny was talking about some of the conditions that are required for people being on parole. I mean, it's just absurd to think that a person who is on community supervision has the money to pay a fee. I mean, we are talking about people who are looking for jobs, people who may not even have might have skipped the train to go to the parole officer. You know, so, and then the payment is dangled in front of your face like a carrot. So let's say if you want to try to get a driver's license to increase your employment opportunities, you would have to pay your supervision fee regularly in order to be considered for something that could increase the likelihood of you not going back to jail or prison or even getting off of community supervision. You know, but you know, even before community supervision and parole, I mean, if we're not looking at the root causes that places people in these positions in the first place, and we're talking about safe communities and what makes communities safe, well, I would like to think that good school systems, health care, less policing, because the same people who are on community supervisions are coming from the same communities that are under surveillance. And so until we start to think about investing in some of these communities, you know, I can't see how these failed systems are going to change. Or do we want it to change? Yes. Oh, you're scaring me. Yeah, I look at you. I see you. Yeah, yeah, and so, yeah, I want to say that even in looking at a parole officer's duty, and it's about basically paroling and I guess they call it care, custody, and control. It's not about supporting those who want to transform their lives. So we rely heavily on community-based organizations and things within the community to support us, and they are not given the resources they need to support. I mean, there are sometimes foundations may require people to move out of a transitional house in 6 months. And so how do people who may have done 10, 15, 20 years really get their life back on track in 6 months? And then you have the probation officer siding with the community-based organization, and you have a big mess that will land you back in prison for not having proper housing or employment. And so it's a vicious cycle that we have going on here, and until we start to work together and look at root causes, I believe that it's hard to overcome.
Thanks, Cheryl. I don't know if this is working, but hopefully you can hear me. So, John, Cheryl talked a lot about outcomes. Your mantra is outcomes. So, what does that look like from your end, thinking about sending people out of your system?
Yeah, I came to this executive session, really unique position as someone who runs a big prison system and someone who got a 2.0 at a state school in Pennsylvania. So Lord knows I'd never thought I'd end up at Harvard for anything. Certainly had the lowest GPA in that room, thank you. But it really was fascinating, and I think a couple of principles really resonate with me. And I got to tell you, and one of the things that people are generally surprised about is that one of the groups I work with is the Association of State Correctional Administrators, who signed off on the Get a Smaller System letter. And the conversations we have, even 7 years ago when I started this job, around the table and what we have today are very different. It used to be care, custody, and control. And when you think that would be the goal of a correction system that impacts millions of people, we shouldn't be happy about that. That's a pretty damn low bar. I mean, if we're going to define public safety or success as not having anybody jump over the fence, I mean, come on. We got to do better than that, especially when you look at the investment that we spend in that. And I think when you talk about outcomes, the absolute first principle, and I think it was third on your list, Bruce, is recognizing the humanity of the individuals who come through the system. And I think it's an embarrassment that we have to say that. But I also think that if we acknowledge the humanity of people impacted by the system, we wouldn't have over 2 million people incarcerated. So I think it really starts with that. And I think related to that is believing in a capacity to change. Understanding that prisons are criminogenic. If you send someone low risk to me, and I tell judges this all the time, they're going to come out more likely to commit another crime. I mean, other than that, it's a great approach, right? I mean, so if we want to undo that, then the community aspect of it, and when someone gets out, to set them up for success is critical. I mean, I really appreciate this notion of redefining public safety. Now, let's be honest. We've used, and policymakers have used, the term public safety as a Trojan horse to mean lock more people up, right? Especially poor people and people of color. I mean, that's what public safety, it's a buzz phrase like truth in sentencing, right? These are buzz phrases that have meanings. But if we're going to define public safety as having individuals come through our system and be successful in the back end of the system, then we have to be deliberate about the conditions at which they are released. And the reality is, and the research would suggest, that when we use the system less, when we function with more precision, we get better outcomes. And it sounds counterintuitive in public safety. It sounds counterintuitive in criminal justice, but it wouldn't sound counterintuitive in the medical field, for instance. I mean, 30 years ago, if you got knee surgery, you'd have a big scar up your leg. Now, if you got knee surgery, you'd have 3 holes. What does that mean? It means that the medical field found a way to, with more precision, to do less damage to your body to heal you. And I think that really, for me, is one of the constructs of this. We need to use the system less and do less damage by the system. We have to acknowledge that the system does damage. And so community corrections is really an opportunity to undo some of that damage. But from a resource standpoint, and folks sitting in my seat, we're responsible for a budget. From a resource standpoint, I mean, even the furthest right group would say, why are we spending money on folks or on resources that don't need it? I mean, probation, field supervision, halfway houses, these are resources that some people do very well through. But if we have folks who actually do worse in that scrutiny, and we're spending more money and getting worse outcomes, why would we do it?
Thanks, John. So, Anne, I know they're hot now. In your world, sort of bridging the worlds of policy and practice, what are some of the things that can produce community well-being, that can avoid doing further harm, that can make the use of those resources wisely?
Thanks. I'm a little afraid of the mic, to tell you the truth, after all of those horrible noises. So I want to say that, first of all, I want to recommend the papers that they're talking about. They're very accessible and readable. And to say I'm an enthusiastic supporter of the principles and the analyses that they put forward. It's certainly consistent with my experience as a practitioner. But I also want to recognize that a lot of this stuff is more easily said than done. It's as much art as science. Some of us have had a fairly steep learning curve about what it means to implement positive youth development principles as an approach, for instance. So when you start talking about a shift from being punitive to rewarding achievement or the good stuff, it makes me think that, in fact, we have to pay attention to like parallel process. That as much as we want to shift the way that supervising officers look at the people on their caseload, we have to change the way that we look at them as professionals and the way that we evaluate their systems. And we don't do a good job of that. I mean, in fact, what probation or parole commissioner gets credit for all of the people under supervision that don't commit a heinous crime or show up, in the Daily News or New York Post. Instead, people who do that work live in fear and wake up in the morning looking at New York One and the papers to see what their day is going to be like, kind of reacting to all of that. So I know that there is a conversation in corrections about how you reward staff in a way that they then are more inclined to reward accomplishment of the people in their charge, but it's definitely like a work in progress. It also requires, I think, more definition about what we mean, and this is where I just want to insert a word of caution. There is no question in the world that it matters to people under supervision if the person that they're reporting to treats them with dignity and respect and sees their humanity and is in their corner. That said, it isn't their job to make sure that somebody gets a GED or accomplishes some things in their life that are clearly going to put them on a path to greater self-sufficiency and whatever. I think that at least the message that I hear Vinnie talking about with less is more is reducing the kind of foot on people's neck and backing up and like practicing our motivational interviewing skills to discover what it is people really want and to advocate on their behalf in the communities that are supposed to be providing those kinds of access and services. So I don't think that, we do this because we have to sometimes. We have to provide education or we have to do that. And I'm not talking about inside. I think we definitely should be doing much more of it inside. But outside, we should be making sure that the community systems and resources that are supposed to deal with housing and employment and health and mental health and substance abuse treatment and the vitality of families and all of those things are including criminal justice involved people, recognizing that they're part of the population they're responsible for. And we can help identify what are the barriers to how they deliver those services to make it more likely that our people are better served by them. But it is that kind of partnership with the community that I think Vinnie was aspiring to in the Neons. And that the best expression of that isn't when the parole or probation officer necessarily becomes the tutor and the counselor and the this and that and the other, but where they're partnering in a really robust kind of way with the community to make sure that the people that we're concerned about are getting services at an individual level and that the systems change is occurring. Was I getting feedback? Okay. Well, I think I was, I guess the other thing I wanted to say is, I was the executive director of the Women's Prison Association for 17 years. And the population of women that I saw were low risk and high need. And so I was a little perplexed at how to be a good criminal justice practitioner as we were learning more and more about not over supervising, over mandating, whatever, people who presented low risk, but they still presented a lot of need. And that's where I came to this kind of conclusion that it was really about advocating with these other systems. Now I'm like seeing more people, mostly men, because of the work that we're doing to increase access to higher ed, both in the prison system and after people have been locked up. I see an awful lot of men who have done 20 years in prison for a homicide-related offense that they committed when they were 17 or 18 or 19 or 20. I don't experience, they committed a violent crime. I do not experience them as a violent person. And, you know, we work with trying to support their going to college while they're on parole, a parole system that even 3 years out, and they've already got their AA degree and are now a BA student, has a 9 o'clock curfew. And if the guys live upstate, you know, might cost $75 to get the car service to go report to their PO on a more regular basis than anyone would think was actually, you know, required. So I just want to you know, end by saying, like, less would really be more for them. And I think that we should figure out how to operationalize that inside ourselves, because we suffer from the same knee-jerk, you know, as well as within our systems.
So I want to reserve time to take questions from the audience, but a lot was said here today, and we've all only spoken once. So I also want to give each of you a chance to respond to what others have said, if you so choose, before we head in that direction.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Ann said as it relates to women in incarceration. And so we know that women are the fastest growing population to be incarcerated over the last 30 years. And so that means that they are coming home at a faster rate. But what have we done what systems have we put in place to make sure that women do not go back to prison? I mean, there aren't any or many gender-specific organizations that work with mothers and kids. I think I can count maybe 2, maybe 3 in New York. And so, yeah, there are some things that we need to think about as it relates to women.
You know, one of the things that Ann said that, and now you, Cheryl, and I was talking to Mark Schindler about this from the Justice Policy Institute yesterday when we were thinking about this panel, is I continue to struggle with the do it better versus do it less. And I think that something we should put on the table. I think that a lot of even decent, well-meaning administrators, when they start to get into the, you know, smart on crime, this is why we're all here, evidence-based stuff, they want more resources to do that stuff. And while there's evidence that certain approaches, motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy, can move the dial for folks, I think overall, writ large, there's not that strong evidence that our systems can be the ones that can improve the lot in life for those folks. Doesn't mean every once in a while somebody doesn't do it, but by and large, I think if you just took an objective look at the record for probation and parole, I think we're a failure. I don't think that if we existed, anyone would invent us. That doesn't, you know, does that mean they shouldn't exist completely? I think an argument can be made for that, but certainly my own personal passion is more toward shrinkage than improvement, and they joust with each other, those two things, as an instinct for administrators. Once you start to improve, it's really hard to shrink at the same time. It's not that you can't do it, but you have to be really conscious about it, because once you start to believe your own stuff, you feel like, well, if this is really good, we should do more of it, not less of it. So I wanted to throw that out as a hopefully provocative thought.
Bruce?
Yeah, this is, I feel Vinny and I are sort of continuing a long-running conversation that we've had, and I think another way of putting the same point is that there's a real tension in progressive thinking about criminal justice policy, and it's between the libertarian impulse not to have the state be interfering in people's lives, and the rehabilitative impulse to provide people in need with help or support. And I think where we ended up in the executive session, I think we were starting to break out of that box a bit, actually, in some way. And I think dominant thinking. Well, let me speak for myself, not the whole session. I think we don't want to be in a place where access to mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment or educational opportunities is conditional on a criminal justice disposition. That's not a policy world we want to be in, and that stuff should be done by someone else who doesn't have powers of arrest and reincarceration. And I think it means really changing how we think about the rehabilitative functions of the criminal justice system. And it should be more of a broker, of handing responsibility for social policy off to social policy agencies who have real expertise and provide those sources of support to people that's not conditional on compliance with conditions of supervision, for example.
I'm scanning your faces. Should we go to audience questions now? Great. So I already see some hands. I know we have a mic, or is this my mic? That's, yeah. I think so.
We haven't and broke them all.
Great. So we'll come around with a mic. We can start with you. You had your hand up early.
Hold the mics in the middle. Hold it.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Amy Sandeman. I work at the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And it sounds like what you guys are all talking about is sort of an all-in approach, that if you keep the problem within the criminal justice system and not include youth services and Department of Education and health services, then the answers all stay within that system. We are trying to look at how public safety is co-produced by so many of these partners, and have launched something called Neighborhood Stat, which is like a corollary to CompStat. So obviously in CompStat, if you just have police in the room, the answers and tools are police answers and tools. We have public housing and Department of Homeless Services and the Parks Department and sanitation all in the room looking with residents, looking at how do you co-produce public safety and what's needed, and is everyone doing the pieces that they should be doing. And so part of that is figuring out what are the new 7 majors, right? Like if 7 majors and metrics are guiding how we define public safety, what are the new 7 majors that are define that public safety? And I'd be curious to hear from the panel if you could choose 7 new civilian 7 majors or 1 new civilian 7 major, what that would be.
Who wants to respond to that question?
I'll throw out 3 of mine. I think we certainly need health, housing, and employment indicators. And I think when we talk about employment, we probably don't want something like an employment rate, because we want people to be retained in jobs that offer the possibility of acquiring skills and having a career. And health means health, I think, rather than just access to healthcare services. And housing is complex. Partly it will mean for correctional populations safe and secure transitional housing. A lot of the housing that we saw in the Boston reentry survey was living with family members, doubling up with family members. So you have two generations, at least two generations in the same household where a lot of caring work is being done by older women in communities. And I think we have to be thinking about the welfare of those older women who are doing a ton of the caring work sort of in the shadow of the correctional system.
I would add a community correctional one, a community control one. I mean, it always struck me that in the map neighborhoods you're in, the 15 neighborhoods, probation, parole, juvenile probation, juvenile parole, now supervised pretrial release, we were in the face of young black and brown men in those neighborhoods at levels that could only have been dreamt of in the headier days of the Great Society. Like, I don't think they ever dreamt we could touch that many people in poor neighborhoods. And here we are. And what is that experience like? Are we out there spreading legitimacy? Or are we out there pissing people off, looking through their underwear drawers, piss testing them, threatening them with incarceration, and then actually incarcerating them? And I think if you could capture that in some measure, I suspect you'd learn something that each of our agencies, me, Parole, Community Supervision, MOCJ, don't know.
I just add one layer to that, and that's the voice of people who are on supervision. And I come from that. Pennsylvania, again, not proud, leads the country in juvenile lifers. And so we came to a place where we were going to be releasing 500 juvenile lifers in Pennsylvania, 300 in Philadelphia alone. And we're confronted with the challenge of releasing people who were incarcerated as children and have spent decades inside a prison. And especially the early releases are people who were good citizens inside prison. But I think the philosophical question for us was, how do we help them translate that to good citizens in the community? And so we're a pretty groundbreaking organization. So we actually did focus groups and asked them, what are your concerns? And if we absent that, what our reentry protocol would look far different than what it looked like after we talked to those 500 juvenile lifers. And I just can't tell you how important it was to first give them a meaningful voice and some ownership and some control over what that path looks like. And I think oftentimes folks like me forget that aspect. And I think it's a key aspect, and I think it's important we say that in every discussion.
So the thought that I had is that, and I don't know how you do it, but I would really like to be able to measure whether there is access to or the opportunity to have access to the housing, the health care, the education, the jobs. And I don't know how you measure that. It's not how many people are employed or unemployed. But I mean, it's something like, do the people who live there have the experience that if they have a desire or whatever, that there is a service or a source of support for them, and do they know how to find it? And then how long does it take to get in, and did they experience it as responsive or not?
Thanks, Ann.
I just want to close by saying I would add providing a livable wage, because when people are under community supervision and they are desperate for a job, and they may get a job, but it doesn't equal rent, or it doesn't equal, even getting the monthly Metro card and rent, or feeding your family. So a livable wage is important.
Thanks, Cheryl. Let's go to the other side.
Hi. I don't know if this is working or not, is it? Dan Stageman, I'm from here at John Jay. So you've talked a little bit about fees and the risks that come along with fees being a part of the probation system. I'm wondering about privatization. Has not been mentioned yet. We do know that a number of the private correctional corporations have been moving very aggressively into this area, into probation and parole. What risks do you see inherent to that movement toward privatization in community corrections?
I'll start, and I think the key is the contracting and how you structure it and what you incentivize. So I think a lot of times we incentivize to save money. So we get shitty practices, right? So in Pennsylvania, we performance contract our halfway houses. So we pay them based on the recidivism rate of individuals adjusted for the risk matrix of the people who go through the centers. And magically, we got improvement because you incentivize the right thing. So I think that's one of the stopgaps. In general, I'm not a big privatization guy because government just does a terrible job with contracting. And we create these perverse incentives and then scratch our heads when we don't get outcomes.
Thanks. Others?
I guess I worry a little about or a lot, I should say, about particularly the private collection agencies. I mean, these folks really can't pay. It's super crazy to think that we could really manage and run any significant portion of our system based on money that we extract from these folks. And one part of the privatization issue is the privatization of the collection of fees. So now you have these private agencies out there depriving people of their liberty because they're not paying and making them profit. It just stinks to high heaven to me. When I started, I had my own little experience with this. I started in February of 2010, so it was like a year and a half after the crash, and New York suffered disproportionately from the crash, and so we were taking ongoing cuts. And so February was kind of budget season, so my staff came to me with how we were going to make our cut, and it was they wanted to charge fees for probation, and I said, well, what's Plan B? Because I'm not doing Plan A, and so. They went back and came back and said, I will have to lay off 195 staff. So I was like, well, when's the last time we laid off staff? Our population used to be 69,000. It's around 25,000 now. I said, oh, we never got rid of staff. I said, okay, then we'll lay off 195 staff. And, not a lot of people are going to do that. So the way my staff perceived this was, so we could have charged the bad guys money or laid off the good guys. And the new commissioner laid off the good guys. So I was in a hole right away because of that. And it taught me a lesson I will never forget, which is how seductive fees are.
So we have about 15 minutes and lots of hands raised, and I want to give you some time to get to the next set of panels too. So we'll go pretty quickly through these next ones. Melissa?
Hey, how's it going? Is this working? It isn't? Okay, great. My name is Melissa Threadgill. I work at the Crime and Justice Institute in Boston. In my day-to-day life, I work with community corrections agencies to implement practices just like you all have in the executive session. And the number one challenge we face is not convincing executive directors and all those folks. They're on board. It's middle management and line supervision staff. Who resist these reforms in a very deep-seated way, and sometimes, frankly, in a way that rises to the level of sabotage. So I'm curious for folks here who've led corrections agencies, what success have you had in reaching those sort of middle and lower layers of the organization to achieve success?
Vinny or John?
My staff was super frustrated with the way things were going in my department. They felt that we didn't have their backs, that they were revoking people that didn't need to be revoked just because they felt like if something bad happened, we would be on them. And we did a major culture change effort, and I love that culture change. Culture eats strategy for lunch, and or breakfast or whatever it is. I love that quote because that was one of those meals, dinner. I don't know. Because I think that more than anything else, like we wanted to reduce violations, we wanted to increase early discharges. I think because I had a really great Christmas party, honest to God, really a great Christmas party, a holiday party, and gave a whole bunch of awards to a whole bunch of people who didn't have rewards. They were like, we had a 6-fold increase in early discharges. We cut violations in half. We had a 3% violation rate by the time I left. That's not because we changed the personnel description or the policies and protocols. It's because people said they wanted to take the same hill I wanted to take. It took a while, but I forgot about my middle managers, to be honest with you. I didn't have that level of management when I was in D.C. It was actually one extra layer of management. And I was like, ooh, what do I do with them? But they schooled me on that, and I thought it was super important, and it's a little worrisome though, because if that's what it takes, like it could swing wildly and things could change. So, I believe that part of this is a culture change thing, but part of it's also policy. Like, probation terms should shrink. So even if we're not all holding hands and singing songs at the Christmas party, at least it's 40% fewer people that are getting shitty probation services.
Yeah, I think it's top down. I think you gotta, set the tone, and the speed of the leader determines the pace of the pack, as they say. But I also think it's bottom up and giving line staff meaningful input into the how. Like when we do major policy change, we put groups together that are generally 2/3 line staff, and I say the what, and they say the how. And the how's not going to be as far as I want to go, but it's going to be, I believe, as far as they can go. And then I'll push them a little further. So I think it's both bottom up, top down, and then in the middle. And I think middle managers are key in this field, and I think that they're often an afterthought. I don't think that's unusual. So we really focus on line staff, get meaningful input, focus on our leadership and holding them accountable. And we have to message directly to those middle managers. And then I think the other thing is we have to define success early on. And this is how we're going to define success, by having less people on supervision, and then measure that and reward it and highlight successes. And giving awards to people, it doesn't always take money. Recognition goes a long way.
Thanks.
And
Oh,
I want
go
to
ahead.
add, it's been my experience that the more that I've done work with community supervision leaders as a formerly incarcerated person, the lesser their guards got. And so they became more open to working with people who have these experiences than seeing them as a client.
We used to have so many experiences that just validate that. Every time we tried to fix something, we did an improvement team. Like, so we wanted to fix our lousy waiting rooms, and that's actually the committee we did for that. They came up with the neon idea, and they were formerly incarcerated people, family members, experts, and line staff, mid-level staff, and so many people came up after me and said, I actually never have had a conversation with somebody with a felony conviction other than across the desk as a sort of client. We changed the names to clients, and then we had events every year, twice a year, that were like conferences, kind of like this, and of course there would always be people on probation, formerly incarcerated people on the panels, and people used to constantly say to me they had not had that conversation. Those folks were only sitting across the desk answering questions. That's what people on probation did. They didn't have opinions. They didn't have thoughts about justice and liberty. It was super interesting to watch that. That was an unexpected outcome. I just thought it was good to hear from folks because they were smart and had something to say. But I hadn't realized how objectified in some respects they had become. Kind of like patient-doctor stuff, right? The doctors, some not great doctors, they view you as just kind of, you're the next case file. Well, certainly that's the way, especially if you have a big caseload.
Thanks. Let's go to the side in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joanna Weil. I'm with the Behavioral Insights team, and I'm also affiliated with UC Santa Cruz. I was wondering how you guys feel about electronic monitoring. On one side, of course, it can shrink the incarceration itself, but often there are fees that are charged to people who are wearing the electronic monitors. So wanted to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Crickets.
I think it's a meh. But I don't know, anybody? I mean, I'm not a huge fan. I don't think the data is all that good on what outcomes you get from it. I think it kind of gives you this false sense of security. People can be beating each other up in their apartments or selling drugs or doing all sorts of crazy stuff, but they're in your apartment, so you feel good about it. Thankfully, in New York, it's kind of almost impossible to use it here because all the water and the subways, they don't really work. So we never were able to use them, even though there was pressure on us to do so. Apparently, they just don't work well. But I just think they're a false sense of safety, and they kind of distance you from the work you really ought to be doing. And then the people you do it on, it almost always seems to wash down to the people who really shouldn't be on it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other aspect of that is, depending on the system and the state and politics, sometimes electronic monitoring is a mechanism that gives people, albeit a false sense of security, a sense of security to incarcerate less, use halfway houses less. So I think there is a role for it. Again, I think you have to have realistic expectations what you're going to get out of it. But putting low-risk folks in a halfway house, for instance, at $75 or $80 a day, it makes a lot more sense if you feel the need for whatever to have a higher level of scrutiny on them. I think there's an application for that. Just realistic expectations, and again, I think everything is dosage and targeting, just like the medical field.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Nazia Fiazi, so I'm from John Jay and Mount Sinai, and I study neuroscience. Okay, I study neuroscience and law. So I was a mentor previously for WPA, and I've also worked with a small re-entry program. And I was in a women's prison, and so I tried to collect some preliminary data from them. And so what I found is that what you said on, women going into the system is the highest rate now. And what I found is that reentry programs are not able to keep up because they were so focused on men coming into the system. And women have very different needs than men do. And that's why I guess that's why they're not keeping up. And some of the needs that I think are similar to men were housing, education, if they are in some sort of drug program, some sort of family support that they needed. I forgot the last one. Any of you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. What do you find that reentry programs are missing the mark on when supporting women when they're coming out? Thank you.
So can I start and then? Yeah. Okay. So, well, I think what she's asking about is why we don't do more with women. The supports just aren't there, and Cheryl was making the same point, and I think that that's largely true, although it's somewhat better, it's significantly better than it was in 1990 when I went to WPA, and I'm not taking credit for that. I'm just saying there at least is a conversation about this. But so I really appreciate the point of view and the advocacy, and believe that women are best served in women-specific services for a lot of reasons, that it's problematic when you just like throw them all into drug treatment, men and women, that kind of thing. That said, I have quit making the case personally that women have needs that are a lot different than men. I think that men also are survivors of trauma and violence, that they also are part of a family and have children, that, all of the needs that I could articulate, with the data about what women's needs are, men have too. The problem is that, men don't call the question in quite the same way that women do. Women have a desire to reunify with their kids, and the system kind of has to deal with that. So women call the question. And unfortunately, we've got a correction system that's it's organized in a way that they think is okay for men, and then it just got imposed on women, but it doesn't work for men either. If we designed a system that worked really well for women and then applied it to men, we might really have something there. But it would be about a whole lot of things that we're not that good at doing. It's all about, how you help people recover from trauma and provide access to housing that they can afford, and access to education and employment that's going to pay a living wage, and provides the substance abuse and mental health and chronic illness kind of treatment that they need, and support their family goals. And we're just not very good at that yet, and we should get good at it for women and for men. And I just have to make one more pitch because I left this out. I think something Vinny was saying earlier reminded me that one of the things that's a common condition in community supervision is that non-association clause, that you're not supposed to associate with other people who've been convicted of a felony. That's got to go. I mean, that is so counter to the human dignity argument. It assumes that they can only be a bad influence on each other, and that is not that's not my experience. My experience is that it is in relationship with each other inside, and when they come out, that they get the most support, the most encouragement, and we should be encouraging that, not discouraging it.
Cheryl.
Yeah, so I just want to first talk about the lack of data that's available for women in incarceration, and I think that is associated with the percentage of women who we're talking about as it relates to men, and it's a small percentage. But my question is, do we have to reach these epic proportions before we realize that we need to be studying this ever-growing population? In addition to that, if we take in consideration that the women who are incarcerated in New York State is, 75% of the women are mothers. If we take that in consideration, and also in consideration that they were the head of their families before incarceration, so then we can look at women and their children as being affected by incarceration, and that would raise the numbers dramatically. In addition, I've worked with men and women coming home in reentry, and the bottom line is that a man's first level of success is getting a job and trying to provide for a family, and while a woman's first level of success is getting her kids back. And so what's in place to support that level of success for women is my question as well.
Thank you so much. And we're going to end it there, although we could talk all day about this clearly. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was really excellent.